this is a special lecture because this is the very first time that we here at the Head Foundation are going to present, as part of our lecture series, original research that we have done here. We are a very new foundation, so it took a little while to produce our own research, and now we actually have something to say that we have produced while we were in existence. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is leadership in the context of the Millennial Generation. The Millennial Generation. Do you know, how many of you know what the Millennial Generation even is? Okay, and still you came. I'm impressed. So what with that millennial thing is? I heard there was a series of books from Sweden about called the Millennial series. That's a different thing. How many of you have heard of that? This detective story series called the Yeah. So a few more have heard of that, perhaps. Anyway, it's not about that. I wish I were a successful crime novelist. I'm not. This is about the Millennial Generation. This is a generation that is roughly born between 1984 and 1996. So those who are today between roughly 18 and 30 years old. How many of you here today are in that bracket? A few, good. So after this, you will be able to tell me exactly how wrong I am, and I look forward to that. So for those of you who are not in the Millennial Generation, this is the way to think about it, perhaps, is that this was the first generation that was really mouse-trained before they were toilet-trained. That's that generation we're talking about. Why do we even care? Why is this important? Why do we want to know something about the attitudes and outlook of the Millennial Generation? I mean, the reason why we here at the Head Foundation got really interested in this it's really based on the premise that very soon, just about every leadership position of consequence in the world, be it in business, in government, in academia, or non-for-profit, will be occupied by someone from the Millennial Generation. So we all have a very strong stake in making sure that they succeed. And to do that, well, we need to know something about what motivates them, what demotivates them, what makes them tick. And I realize that here, for those of you who are millennials here, I talk about you as if you are animals in zoo that we've dissected. That's not how you should take this. We depend on you for our future. That's how you should take what I'm saying. And there are strong reasons to believe that this generation is different from prior generations, because of the rapid accelerating rate of change that globalization has brought, because of the explosion of information accessibility that the internet has brought. And we know this from prior studies of the Millennial Generation. There are actually a few other studies of millennials out there, which begs the question, why do we need another one? Well, the reason why we came together, and we here is, in addition to the Head Foundation, the Emerging Markets Institute at INSEAD, where I'm also on the faculty, and Universum, which is a research firm based in Stockholm, Sweden. The reason why we came together and wanted to do this study was that we found that the studies that had been done tended to be either quite based on a very small sample or on a very skewed sample. Typically, these studies were made based on responses from only American respondents or only Western European respondents. And we felt that while the results were very valuable, there was also a risk in relying on data like that when drawing conclusions and making decisions, because those decisions about how to attract, retain, educate, and develop millennials might be wrong if it's based on a skewed sample. So the result is this study, which is really the biggest of its kind. We sampled 16,000 millennials in 43 countries. And what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to present some of the results, and what you will find is that the results are fine-grained. We found that some of the results are very similar to the results we've seen before. Prior results were held up, in other words. But then there are other results that were not held up. But perhaps most interestingly, from our perspective, was that most of the results actually depended quite a bit on the cultural context, on the specific country or region that the millennials we polled were from. Big differences, as you will see. So what I'm going to do now is really three things. I'm going to introduce you to some of the research questions that that guided our study and the data. And then I'm going to give you a sample of the findings. This is preliminary still. It's still evolving, so it's not complete yet. But I want to give you a sample of what we found. And finally, I want to say something about implications. Now, this lecture is a little bit different from what we have usually done here, and certainly what I've usually done here before. Those of you who have been here before listening to me, thank you for coming back. You will know that usually I do things pretty interactively, and we talk ourselves through the lectures. Here, it will be more sequential. What I will do is that I will do a presentation. I will broadcast, and you will sit there and listen. And then, when I'm done, which is in 20 minutes or so, then we have plenty of time for questions. And I'm really interested in hearing your questions about this. Because, of course, I'm talking about a cultural context that you know far better than me. So you might say, well, yeah, that sounds interesting, but here's why I'm not totally convinced. Those kinds so I'm very interested in any skeptical question you might have, things that you feel, some things will probably resonate, but some will not, and then we'll discover together why that might be. So that's the spirit here. I'm going to give you some results, and then you're going to ask questions and perhaps also voice some skepticism if there's something here that you feel doesn't really resonate with your experience. So that's where we're going. Sounds okay? All right. So first, just something about the basic questions here. We were generally interested in essentially a benchmarking study of the attitudes and the outlook of the millennial generation. But there are two angles in particular we were interested in. The first one was we wanted to check if the received notions from prior studies held up. And secondly, to the extent to which attitudes and outlooks of the millennial generation vary depending on the region and the cultural context. We found when we looked through prior studies that very often millennials, they were spoken about and written about as if they were the same all over the world, and we wanted to check this notion, the extent to which it's correct, and we were particularly interested in the Asia-Pacific context, of course, and I'm going to give some summary points towards the end specifically about the Singaporean context. I won't say much about this, about the data. I said it's more than 16,000 respondents. Just want to draw your attention to that. About a third of the respondents are from the Asia-Pacific region. Now, about those received notions, the conventional wisdoms, what we think that what we know about millennials, the first one that we tested was this. Millennials are interested in leadership and rapid career progression. This is one of those things that prior studies say that this is true, and we found that yes, on average, this is true. But if you look at the average, well, that tends to hide some really interesting cultural differences. So we found considerable difference, for example, in why millennials in different parts of the world seek out leadership positions. It can be because of the money. It can be because of opportunities to coach and mentor. It could be because it's seen as a good foundation to a successful career generally. So it could be very different answers. And when it came to the question of what a good leader is, the kind of leader that millennials want to follow, well, then the answers were all over the place. There were many answers and perspectives as there were countries in the study. It could be about wanting to have a fair manager, someone who is empowering, someone who has all the answers, a lot of different answers. So I'm going to give you here a few specifics. Now, apologies for the very busy slides. We won't go through all the details here. Don't worry. I will just pick out some of the highlights. 69% of Asia-Pacific millennials see becoming a leader as very important, and we define that as important. We define that as 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale. And it turns out that Singaporean millennials scored just about the highest of any country, which we found interesting. Now, why would you want to become a leader then? Well, all kinds of reasons: money, influence, challenges. Millennials from Asia Pacific scored generally pretty low on becoming a leader to have opportunities to coach and mentor. Singaporean millennials stood out for being focused on leadership because of high future earnings. So that was something that stood out in this context. Now, here was an interesting twist here we found. We found that in Asia Pacific, in particular, millennials, they would rather want to become a specialist than a generalist. They would rather want to become an expert than a manager. Now, at first blush, this might seem a bit counterintuitive, perhaps. After all, a leader isn't a leader almost by definition a generalist. Isn't a leader a general manager? Well, what emerged from the data, which helped resolve this apparent contradiction, was that what we also found was that millennials in Asia Pacific was particularly collaborative in their outlook. So the hypothesis here is that there's a slightly different paradigm of leadership that emerges in this generation, which is different from top-down, more distributed, where you can be an expert leader and you rely on people who are experts in other areas. So the hypothesis is that perhaps the millennials in Asia Pacific are emerging as harbingers of distributed leadership, less command and control than before. Now, I want to say that we actually don't have any comparative data from the older generation in this study. That's something that we're trying to find, but we can see based on other studies that there seemed to have been a bit of a shift. We'll be interested to hear if that rings true to you. All right, the next one that we wanted to test was this notion that millennials, they define challenging work in other terms than working hard. And we found that, yes, that is true. It doesn't translate into an unwillingness to work hard, though. Possible exception for some reason are the good people and millennials of Central and Eastern Europe. But let's focus on Asia Pacific and Singapore once again. Turns out that the one thing that stood out as the most important dimension of challenging work for millennials in Asia Pacific is innovation. So that's how this generation really feels. That's what's challenging work, and they mean that in a positive way. It is a little bit lesser in Singapore. 44% says that it's somewhat or strongly important. So not all Singaporean millennials see innovation as a deal breaker. Another received notion: millennials care more about personal development and work-life balance than money and status. We find that that's true on average. Now, one thing that is interesting and important here is how you define work-life balance. Traditionally, we find that many people think about work-life balance as a balance between work and family. This what we found here was slightly different. The self, the individual was more important. So it's not only work and family, but it's room for being an individual, for self-expression. And This was a little bit less true, actually, in the Asia-Pacific and Singaporean context. And this is what we spoke about in the video that you just saw, that we saw a tension here because we saw that there was both a push towards individual expression and a push for belonging to the collective in the context of millennials in Singapore and in the Asia-Pacific. And so what we saw emerge was this almost existential question here in the Singaporean context. How can I be myself and still belong? I think that captures something, and that's why I mentioned it in the interview. So there, it's a what we see here, which is different from the Western world, it's a bit of a tension between the new and the old. The new is individualism coming with globalization, and the old is a tradition of collectivism, which is deeply rooted in the culture in many parts in these parts of the world. So it's something to discuss perhaps afterwards. Now, a few things that did not hold up. The previous findings say that most millennials, they fear that they will never be able to retire. We didn't find that at all. This is particularly strong in the American context in previous studies, this idea that we as millennials, so not really me, but we as millennials, we won't be able to have as a safe career as our parents. We won't be able to have the financial security of our parents. We are afraid to retire. Well, we didn't find that at all in the Asia-Pacific region. We were quite surprised with that. We didn't find that there was actually much more optimism in Asia-Pacific compared to North America and Western Europe. But then, as always, when you go into the details, you find big differences. So in Asia-Pacific, there's a huge difference between the Chinese, who are very positive, and the Australians, who are much less so. So no fear about not being able to retire among the majority, but there are fears. And this is, I think, what my colleague Vinika mentioned in the video, that there are fears about getting stuck. Strong fears about getting stuck in a career that you don't like, that you can't get out of. That was something that came out very clearly. Then we had questions about where the power in society resides. And one prior finding is that millennials feel that government has a lot of power, a lot of influence in society. On average, we find that not to be true in our data set, but there are a lot of differences across the different countries here. In fact, in the Asia-Pacific region, millennials do have a strong belief in the power of government, and Singapore is the place where millennials feel that the government has the strongest influence of all. Now, then you might say that, well, that's just a fact. And there's probably something to that the Singaporean government probably objectively is more powerful than, say, the Italian government. Last time I looked, they had a little bit of a hard time having their voice heard. So there will be differences, of course, that are directly where you have to say that perception is close to reality, perhaps. Now, another piece that perhaps is more interesting is that, as we talked about, asked them about power in society, there is the question of business and what kind of power business has in society. And by and large, millennials think that business has a lot of power, and they think they should contribute. So there's a strong sense among the millennials that not only is business powerful, but with great power comes great responsibility. I know someone who said that. Spider-Man, that's right. With great power comes with great responsibility, and that seems to be something that is reflected in the views of business among the millennials. And I think this is a final notion that I wanted to just bring up. And that's the notion that friends and family are influential in determining career issues and for millennials. And that we found, perhaps surprisingly, was not the case. Not even Asia Pacific, actually, which was most open to the idea, there's still a minority who responded that yes, my parents and my friends, they have a strong influence on my career decisions. And Japan and Singapore actually stood out for relatively low parental involvement in career decisions. Same for friends generally, but the exception here is Asia Pacific. So it seems like in Asia Pacific, Millennial Generation, they're quite open to advice from their peers about careers, more so than from their parents. Although Singapore scored a little bit lower there than Asia Pacific in general. Now, a key distinction though here is between advice and support. So for those of you who are parents of millennials, if you feel that, I thought they actually listened to me when I had something to say about the career of my millennial child, well, even if they might not want to have your career advice, they do depend on your support. So there's a strong appreciation of support from friends and family. So I think the message is, well, don't tell me what to do, but please be there and support me if I need it to. Although Singaporeans are not quite as reliant on family for support as some other countries in Asia Pacific. All right, so those are just a few excerpts. We are now working on a report, actually, that is going to be quite comprehensive, and I hear the latest is that it's 300 pages long, and we need to figure out what to do with that. Because one thing that we learned about millennials is that they are unlikely to read something that is 300 pages long. So we're tapering this down, but very soon, in a few weeks, this will be available, downloadable for free, and you can just go to our website and there will be a link to that. In the meantime, though, I just want to give you a few summary points about millennials in Singapore, particularly. So everyone wants to become a leader. So Singaporean millennials are no exception there. Singaporeans stand out for wanting to be leaders because of the money. Specialists rather than generalists, experts rather than managers. I touched on this. Perhaps we see a different leadership construct taking form here, where you have expert leaders who depend more on team-based leadership. That's a hypothesis. Singaporean millennials, they want to be empowered. They do not want to be micromanaged. That stood out as very, very strong. But, and I think this was mentioned in the video as well, they certainly do want to get feedback on their performance. So it's not just hands off. It's just, don't micromanage me, but please do give me feedback, constructive feedback about how I'm doing. And their Singaporeans actually stood out as feeling more strongly this way than some millennials in other parts of the world. And this goes back to what I already mentioned, this tension between high on both autonomy and high on the importance of social ties. And I found this fascinating, how millennials in Singapore in particular scored high on both. I want to be myself, I want to be autonomous, but I also want to belong to the collective. It's a particular tension that we see here that we don't see elsewhere at all to the same extent. Few implications then. There are implications for many different stakeholders here, I think, but perhaps most obviously for companies and organizations that want to attract, retain, educate, and develop millennials. And so one thing here that is perhaps obvious, and as a leadership professor, I might not be an objective observer of this, but in a world where work is getting more routinized, more automized, more robotized, well, in that kind of world, a focus on leadership development will be critical for success, critical for developing the millennials to into leaders that can take us into the future, that can do the work that all those robots and machines cannot do. So how do you do that? Well, one piece of that, we believe, is what we refer to as a granular strategy. So what is that? Well, it's really two parts. And the first part is to make sure that we have an accurate picture of attitudes and outlooks in different countries, in different regions. An accurate picture of what is normal in different cultures. Treating Japanese and Indians as if they are the same, well, that can be disastrous. Now, in daily life, we don't seem to have a problem with this. We tend to sort of acknowledge that, yeah, different cultures are different, and if you're from India, say, you tend to be more okay with being late for dinner than, say, a Swede, and that's okay. We learn to live with that. But somehow, when it comes to millennials, we seem to have forgotten this, and we treat them as if they're the same all over the place. So the first step is, but if the first step is to recognize and have an accurate picture of what is normal in every culture, then the second piece is to recognize that no one is normal in every way. So what this research shows is what is normal for millennials in different cultures on average, but no one is normal in every way. It doesn't necessarily say anything about how to manage, deal with, attract, develop, educate the individual millennial. And if we know one thing about millennials is this, is that millennials all over the world, they want to be treated as individuals. They want to have an individualistic approach. So when it comes to leadership development and developing millennials into tomorrow's leaders, we have to think about it as an individual approach, but be mindful of the cultural differences. All right, this is my last slide here. I just wanted to, again, say that this is preliminary findings from part of this study, and it focuses specifically on the Millennial Generation. Next here, we are now looking at attitudes, perceptions among senior executives and CEOs about the Millennial Generation. And the idea is that we want to try to track gaps between actual attitudes and senior leaders' perception of those attitudes. And if there are large gaps there, well, that's something to explore. But that's for next time. And that's really what I wanted to leave you with. So now I want to thank you for sitting there patiently and listening to me for how long? Half an hour. I thought it was going to be less than that. And so let me then end by emphasizing what I started with. This is the first cut of the first study, and we're going to continue to do this. I want to thank you for all your input. This was very, very valuable. So thank you so much. You're the first audience to get a chance to really see this. So thank you for being guinea pigs in that regard. And then I hope you'll come back when we are ready to present the next iteration. So thank you very much.